So who's up for a thriller? Will Netflix's The Beast in Me be your next twisty, intense mystery binge? Since the tragic death of her young son, acclaimed author Aggie Wiggs has receded from public life, unable to write, a ghost of her former self. But she finds an unlikely subject for a new book when the house next door is bought by Nile Jarvis, a famed and formidable real estate mogul who once was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. At once horrified and fascinated by this man, Aggie finds herself compulsively hunting for the truth in a game of cat and mouse that might turn deadly. This stars Claire Danes and Matthew Rhys, along with Brittany Snow, Natalie Morales, Jonathan Banks, and David Lyons. Now, it's an 8-episode limited series, and it revolves around a writer and then this sketchy real estate dude. Danes, as Aggie, is presented to be an unreliable narrator because she's still in the throes of grief over the loss of her son. And she's pretty much given up on life, but still attempts to go through the motions, giving off this facade that she's functioning and progressing past her sorrow. She has nightmares and relives her trauma, leading us to question whether a lot of her interactions and experiences are factual or are instead just colored by her immense sadness. And then we have Rhys as Nile. Now, he's overly confident and self-assured. He immediately comes across as arrogant, condescending, even somewhat misogynistic, creating this sense that he doesn't value women so much as people, but rather as things that he can manipulate or control. And there's doubt surrounding who he is as a person. I mean, not in his identity, but in his integrity. His wife had disappeared years earlier, so of course the husband is always the suspect. But what we have to figure out is if he was really involved or not. I wasn't fully sold in the first episode. It's not like it was poorly executed or imagined. It was the characters were all so distasteful that I wasn't sure I wanted to spend the next 8-ish hours with a ton of terrible people. But as the episodes progressed, I did become engrossed in the story and was then intrigued by what would happen next. There is a certain predictability to the overall plot. I appreciate how the story presents us with ideas that seem too obvious, creating this doubt that the answer can't just be as simple as it appears. The actions by characters, they can be a bit shocking at times, but I don't think they're unexpected. Yeah, that sounds like a contradiction, I know. I just mean that when I say shocking, there are abrupt behaviors that are in line with what's anticipated, but the suddenness can also be surprising. That's part of the predictability within the storytelling. I mean, the characters and the motivations, they're pretty much laid bare for us, even though they're assumed to be obscured and mysterious. And there was probably only one instance where I truly did not see an action coming, and that was at the very end of the show. Now, I don't say all this is a massive negative because I was still invested in the drama, and the acting created some suspenseful tension between the characters. But after sitting with this for a while, the cleverness that I initially thought was there wasn't ingenious storytelling at all, but instead convincingly dark character creation on the part of the cast. The story does something in one of the last few episodes that I thought was a very curious decision. We're given a scenario that provides some great foreshadowing, and it would have been an inventive way to create hints at what the truth might be. But because we're shown this after we've already been shown elements that this episode was foreshadowing, it was essentially post-shadowing, and then just kind of strange. I mean, like the arc was confirming something that we already knew to be true. Had they placed this episode earlier in the series, or at least a portion of it, it would have created more anticipation for what would come next. As it stands, it's an episode that could have been a quick scene rather than something that stops down to create this massive flashback. The plot attempts to make itself more complex by adding in some side elements that highlight the ruthlessness or sketchiness of certain characters. But this also has the effect of convoluting the arc and incorporating aspects that should have been drastically condensed. We get a couple of tangents that involve a few FBI agents, and while they both do have direct ties into the main arc, we get extra information that either comes about way later than it needed to, or it goes into a depth that was already obvious and therefore unnecessary. It's not like these aspects were terrible additions, but they did add extra time that could have been trimmed for expediency. The filming for this has a few unique visual styles that set it apart from other mysteries. Now, one is in its symmetry. Now, it's not to the degree of a Wes Anderson film, but more often than not, the subject is placed directly in the center of the frame with a disorienting depth of focus. It's not shallow by any means. Both the subject and backgrounds are in focus simultaneously, but there's sort of a distortion that happens to bring about an odd but effective visual. And I can't tell if they're using a wide-angle lens and then getting in very close to the subject so that it creates this warped sort of perspective, but however they accomplish it, the result is something that brings about this sense of unease. The other visual styling has to do with the contrast and saturation of the series itself. Now you'll notice that the contrast for this is cranked way up, creating somewhat harsh distinctions between lights and the darks. And the saturation, it's also cranked up, further enhancing the effects of that contrast. And the colorings, they're not typically bright or vivid. Instead, though, we get these sharp, almost hard shadow lines that create somewhat blinding bright spots. And what this does for the characters, especially when it comes to Aggie and Nile, is they become more haggard looking, more aged or tired, worn down by the stresses of life, where any slight wrinkles or lines are exaggerated and then made more intense. It also makes them appear somewhat unreal, almost plastic or fake. And I completely appreciate how that works to support the behaviors in the characters we see. They're both sketchy and somewhat unreliable, so to then have them visually come across as unnatural, it's a complementary effect that subtly reinforces their performances. Now, I wasn't totally a fan of the styling, which is simply just a personal thing and has no impact on the quality or impression of the series, but I do appreciate how it's utilized to augment the storytelling. So overall, while I was initially fully enamored with The Beast in Me, the series lost a lot of its polish and appeal the longer I sat with it. The acting by Claire Danes and Matthew Rhys is wonderful, utilizing a mixture of anger, ferocity, grief, and doubt to establish characters who are endearing and simultaneously untrustworthy. The pacing is efficient, but could build more tension with the reordering of certain story reveals and trimmed plot elements. And although the story is intriguing, the predictability and lack of cleverness hinder the overall enjoyment, making for something fun in the moment, but it disappears from memory the moment the show concludes. There's sex, no nudity, a lot of profanity, and some brutal violence. I give The Beast in Me 3 out of 5 couches. This is decent for a one-time binge, so if you are in need of a weekend watch, you might want to give it a go. So have you watched any effective and lasting thrillers lately? I'd love to get some recommendations in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.